안녕하세요. 네, today we are doing chapter 21 and it's called A New Departure in Flavorings. Dear me, there's nothing but meetings and partings in this world, as Mrs. Lynde says, remarked Anne plaintively, putting her slate and books down on the kitchen table on the last day of June and wiping her red eyes with a very damp handkerchief. Wasn't it fortunate, Marilla, that I took an extra handkerchief to school today? I had a presentiment that it would be needed. 네, 여기서 Dear me, there's nothing but meetings and partings. 원래 meeting은 우리 미팅, 회의라고 생각을 하지만 여기서는 그게 아니라는 걸 어떻게 알 수 있죠? 그 다음 단어가 parting이라고 나오잖아요. 그러니까 만남과 헤어짐밖에 없는 것 같아요. 앤이 얘기했어요. I had a presentiment. 이거는 예감. 나는 손수건을 가져가길 잘했어. 내 예감에 필요할 것 같았거든요. 뭐가? 손수건을 하나 더 가져갔대요. 레이첼님 안녕하세요. 알리시아님 오늘은 일찍 들어오셨어요, 두 분. I never thought you were so fond of Mr. Phillips that you'd require two handkerchiefs to dry your tears just because he was going away, said Marilla. 네가 그렇게 미스터 필립스를 언제부터 그렇게 좋아해서 손수건이 두 개나 필요했어? I don't think I was crying because I was really so very fond of him, reflected Anne. I just cried because all the others did. 내가 그를 그렇게 좋아해서 운 것 같진 않아요. 그냥 다른 사람들이 다 울어서 그런 것 같아요. It was Ruby Gillis started it. Ruby Gillis has always declared she hated Mr. Phillips, but just as soon as he got up to make his farewell speech, she burst into tears. Then all the girls began to cry, one after the other. I tried to hold out, Marilla. I tried to remember the time Mr. Phillips made me sit with a boy, and the time he spelled my name without an E on the blackboard, and how he said I was the worst dunce he ever saw at geometry and laughed at my spelling, and all the times he had been so horrid and sarcastic. But somehow I couldn't, Marilla, and I just had to cry too. Jane Andrews has been talking for a month about how glad she'd be when Mr. Phillips went away, and she declared she'd never shed a tear. Well, she was worse than any of us and had to borrow a handkerchief from her brother. Of course, the boys didn't cry because she hadn't brought one of her own, not expecting to need it. Oh, Marilla, it was heartrending. Mr. Phillips made such a beautiful farewell speech beginning, "The time has come for us to part." It was very affecting, and he had tears in his eyes too, Marilla. Oh, I felt dreadfully sorry and remorseful for all the times I'd talked in school and drawn pictures of him on my slate and made fun of him and Prissy. I can tell you I wished I'd been a model pupil like Minnie Andrews. She hadn't anything on her conscience. 네, 여기까지 가볼게요. Alright. 자기도 울음을 안 울으려고 참았는데 근데 여자애들이 다 울기 시작해서 자기도 울 수밖에 없었다고. 안 울으려고 어떻게 노력을 했죠? 자기를 길버트를 말하다가 말았죠. 길버트 남자아이랑 옆에 앉으려고 하는 앉게 하고 그다음에 자기 이름을 E 없이 칠판에다가 쓰고 그리고 geometry를 그렇게 못하는 사람은 처음 봤다 그러고 또 스펠링에 대해서 웃고 그렇게 한 거를 생각을 하려고 했는데 생각이 안 났대요. 제인 앤드루스는 자기가 미스터 필립스가 가면은 얼마나 기쁠지에 대해서 얘기를 해 놓고선 그리고 절대로 눈물 한 방울 안 흘릴 거라고 했는데 제일 심했다고 제인 앤드루스가. 그리고 너무 아름다운 스피치를 했다 그러죠. farewell speech. 이별 스피치. The time has come for us to part. 우리가 헤어질 시간이 됐습니다. 그래서 누구처럼 되고 싶다 그랬었죠? 누구처럼 할 걸 그랬다고 생각했죠? 미니 앤드루스. 자기도 미니 앤드루스처럼 모범생이 될 걸 그랬다. 왜냐하면 그녀는 양심에 아무것도 안 걸리니까. The girls cried all the way home from school. Carrie Sloane kept saying every few minutes, "The time has come for us to part." And that would start us off again whenever we were in any danger of cheering up. 우리가 기분이 좋아지려고 하기만 하면 또 "이제 우리가 헤어질 시간이 됐습니다." 해서 우리 또 다시 울고 또 울고 그랬대요. I do feel dreadfully sad, Marilla, but one can't feel quite in the depths of despair with 2 months vacation before them, can they, Marilla? 정말 슬프지만 앞으로 2달 동안 2달 동안 방학이 있는데 완전히 우울할 수는 없겠죠? And besides, we met the new minister and his wife coming from the station. For all I was feeling so bad about Mr. Phillips going away, I couldn't help taking a little interest in a new minister, could I? His wife is very pretty. 새로운 목사가 오고 그의 아내는 아주 예쁘대요. Not exactly regally lovely, of course. It wouldn't do, I suppose, for a minister to have a regally lovely wife. 제왕답게 아름다운. Because it might set a bad example. Mrs. Lynde says the minister's wife over at Newbridge sets a very bad example because she dresses so fashionably. Our new minister's wife was dressed in blue muslin with lovely puffed sleeves and a hat trimmed with roses. Jane Andrews said she thought puffed sleeves were too worldly for a minister's wife. But I didn't make any such uncharitable remark, Marilla, because I know what it is to long for puffed sleeves. 제인 안드루스는 이렇게 뽕이 있는 소매? 팔 슬리브가 너무 세상적인데 minister의 와이프로 하기는 하지만 자기는 그런 말을 안 했다. 왜냐하면 자기는 얼마나 뭐를 원하는 걸 puff sleeves를 원하는 게 어떤 느낌인지 알기 때문에. Besides, she's only been a minister's wife for a little while, so one should make allowances, shouldn't they? allowance는 주로 우리 용돈을 얘기를 하지만 여기서는 봐줘야 되지 않겠어요? They're going to board with Mrs. Lynde until the manse is ready. 네, manse는 목사관입니다. If Marilla, in going down to Mrs. Lynde's that evening, was actuated by any motive save her avowed one of returning the quilting frames she had borrowed the preceding winter, it was an amiable weakness shared by most of the Avonlea people. Many a thing Mrs. Lynde had lent, sometimes never expecting to see it again, came home that night in charge of the borrowers thereof. 네, 이게 무슨 말일까요? Mrs. Lynde가 Marilla가 Mrs. Lynde 집으로 갔다 그러죠. 자기의 말로는 왜 간다 그랬었죠? Of returning the quilting frames. 퀼팅하는 뭐 도구를 돌려주러 갔다고 하는데 그거 말고도 다른 목적으로 갔더라면 봐줄 수 있는 약점 shared. Avonlea의 사람들이 공통으로 가지고 있는 약점이었다. Many a thing Mrs. Lynde had lent. Mrs. Lynde가 많은 것들을 빌려줬대요. Sometimes never expecting to see it again. 다시 돌려받을 생각을 어쩔 때는 안 했는데 came home that night in charge of the borrowers thereof. 다시 돌려주려고 그날 딱 다들 가지고 온 거예요. 왜 그랬을까요? 네. Mrs. Lynde 집에서 새로운 목사와 그의 부인이 Mrs. Lynde 집에 있을 거니까. A new minister, and moreover, a minister with a wife, was a lawful object of curiosity in a quiet little country settlement where sensations were few and far between. sensation, 는 우리 sensational하다는 거는 되게 놀랍다라는 거죠. 그러니까 sensation은 noun인데 신나는 사건들이 거의 없었다는 거죠. Few and far between. Old Mr. Bentley, the minister whom Anne had found lacking in imagination, had been pastor of Avonlea for 18 years. 전 목사는 18년 동안 했었죠, 목사를. He was a widower when he came, and a widower he remained, despite the fact that gossip regularly married him to this, that, or the other one every year of his sojourn. 네, widower는 원래 widow는 여자가 남편을 잃은 사람을 과부, widow라고 하는데 남자가 아내를 잃으면 widower라고 합니다. 네, draw 제이님 안녕하세요. In the preceding February, he had resigned his charge and departed amid the regrets of his people, most of whom had the affection born of long intercourse for their good old minister, in spite of his shortcomings as an orator. 네, 그의 연설가로서의 단점이 있어도 되게 너무 서로 좋아했었다는 거죠. 너무 오래 같이 있었기 때문에. Since then, the Avonlea Church had enjoyed a variety of religious dissipation in listening to the many and various candidates and supplies who came Sunday after Sunday to preach on trial. 네, 시범으로 많은 목사들이 와서 설교를 했었대요. These stood or fell by the judgment of the fathers and mothers in Israel. But a certain small red haired girl who sat meekly in the corner of the old Cuthbert pew also had her opinions about them and discussed the same in full with Matthew, Marilla always declining from principle to criticize ministers in any shape or form. 네, Annie 항상 Matthew에게 어쩌고 저쩌고 이 사람은 어떻고 저 목사는 저렇고 얘기를 했었대요. 왜냐하면 Matthew에게만 왜냐하면 Marilla는 그런 목사를 흉보는 일 절대로 안 하니까. 아 네. 설거지 하시면서 네 수고 많으시네요, 밤늦게까지. "I don't think Mr. Smith would have done," Matthew said was Anne's final summing up. Mrs. Lynde said his delivery was so poor, but I think his worst fault was just like Mr. Bentley's. He had no imagination. 네 delivery는 연설을 어떻게 주냐, 연설을 어떻게 하냐 이건데 그것보다도 그는 상상력이 전혀 없었어. And Mr. Terry had too much. He let it run away with him just as I did mine in the matter of the haunted wood. Besides, Mrs. Lynde says his theology wasn't sound. Mr. Gresham was a very good man and a very religious man, but he told too many funny stories and made the people laugh in church. He was undignified. And you must have some dignity about a minister, mustn't you, Matthew? 위엄이 없었다고, 품위가 조금 떨어졌다고. I thought Mr. Marshall was decidedly attractive. 아, 되게 잘생겼다고? But Mrs. Lynde says he isn't married or even engaged because she made special inquiries about him, and she says it would never do to have a young, unmarried minister in Avonlea because he might marry in the congregation, and that would make trouble. Mrs. Lynde is a very far-seeing woman, isn't she, Matthew? 네, 여기서 far-seeing은 뭘까요? see는 보다, far는 멀리. 앞을 잘 내다보는 여자인 것 같아요. I'm very glad they've called Mr. Allen. I liked him because his sermon was interesting, and he prayed as if he meant it, and not just as if he did it because he was in the habit of it. Mrs. Lynde says he isn't perfect, but she supposes we couldn't expect a perfect minister for $750 a year. And anyhow, his theology is sound because she questioned him thoroughly on all the points of doctrine. And she knows his wife's people, and they are most respectable, and the women are all good housekeepers. Mrs. Lynde says that sound doctrine in the man and good housekeeping in the woman make an ideal combination for a minister's family. 네, 왜 완벽한 목사를 바랄 수 없을까요? 네, 왜냐하면 for $750 a year, 1년에 $750만 줘가지고 어떻게 완벽한 목사를 바랄 수 있겠냐? 아, 배청님 안녕하세요. 오랜만입니다. The new minister and his wife were a young, pleasant faced couple, still in their honeymoon, and full of all good and beautiful enthusiasms for their chosen life work. Avonlea opened its heart to them from the start. Old and young, like the frank, cheerful young man with his high ideals, and the bright, gentle little lady who assumed the mistressship of the manse. With Mrs. Allen, Anne fell promptly and wholeheartedly in love. She had discovered another kindred spirit. All right, anybody have any questions so far? Or comments? 네, 알려주시면 I will try to answer. All right. Mrs. Allen is perfectly lovely, she announced one Sunday afternoon. She's taken our class, and she's a splendid teacher. She said right away she didn't think it was fair for the teacher to ask all the questions. And you know, Marilla, that is exactly what I've always thought. She said we could ask her any question we liked, and I asked ever so many. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla. 네, 뭐라고 했길래 앤이 딱 마음에 들었을까요? 선생만 질문들을 다 하는 건 공평하지 않으니까 너네들도 원하는 질문 다 해 봐." 그래서 자기는 많이 물어봤고 자기는 정말 질문하는 걸 잘한다고. "I believe you," was Marilla's emphatic comment. Nobody else asked any except Ruby Gillis, and she asked if there was to be a Sunday school picnic this summer. I didn't think that was a very proper question to ask because it hadn't any connection with the lesson. The lesson was about Daniel and the lion's den. But Mrs. Allen just smiled and said she thought there would be. Mrs. Allen has a lovely smile. She has such exquisite dimples in her cheeks. 보조개가 너무 아름답대요. I wish I had dimples in my cheeks, Marilla. I'm not half so skinny as I was when I came here, but I have no dimples yet. 처음 왔을 때만큼 삐쩍 마르진 않았지만 아직 보조개가 없어요. If I had, perhaps I could influence people for good. 보조개가 있었더라면 내가 선한 영향력을 가지고 사람들에게 영향을 줄 텐데. Okay, I'm sorry for my terrible Korean. Mrs. Allen said we ought always to try to influence other people for good. She talked so nice about everything. I never knew before that religion was such a cheerful thing. I always thought it was kind of melancholy, but Mrs. Allen's isn't, and I'd like to be a Christian if I could be one like her. I wouldn't want to be one like Mr. Superintendent Bell. It's very naughty of you to speak so about Mr. Bell, said Marilla severely. Mr. Bell is a real good man. Oh, of course he's good, agreed Anne, but he doesn't seem to get any comfort out of it. If I could be good, I'd dance and sing all day because I was glad of it. 내가 정말 그렇게 선했더라면 나는 하루 종일 춤추고 노래할 거예요. I suppose Mrs. Allen is too old to dance and sing, and of course, it wouldn't be dignified in a minister's wife. But I can just feel she's glad she's a Christian and that she'd be one, even if she could get to heaven without it. Um, Mrs. Allen은 아 크리스찬인 거에 대해서 정말 기뻐한다. 천국에 가지 못해도 그래도 크리스천일 것 같아요. I suppose we must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen up to tea some day soon, said Marilla reflectively. They've been most everywhere but here. Let me see. Next Wednesday would be a good time to have them. But don't say a word to Matthew about it, for if he knew they were coming, he'd find some excuse to be away that day. Matthew에겐 얘기하지 마. 왜냐면 어떤 핑계를 찾아서 그날 안 올 거야. He's got so used to Mr. Bentley, he didn't mind him, but he's going to find it hard to get acquainted with a new minister, and a new minister's wife will frighten him to death. 새로운 목사에게 익숙해지는 것도 어려워하지만 와이프는 정말 무서워할 거야. I'll be as secret as the dead, assured Anne. But oh, Marilla, will you let me make a cake for the occasion? I'd love to do something for Mrs. Allen, and you know I can make a pretty good cake by this time. 저 케이크 만들어도 될까요? 어, out of it. Get out of it. 그 말인가요? out of it가 어디 나왔을까요? 제인 님이 물어보셨는데. out of it? 여기서 나왔나요? 알려주시면 제가 말씀드릴게요. out of it. 그냥 out of it는 주로 get out of the situation. 이거는 핑계에 대해서 그 상황에서 벗어난다는 뜻이기도 한데 I'm so out of it 하면 나 정신이 하나도 없어. 이런 뜻도 되거든요. 제가 말을 했군요. 여기에는 없는 것 같아요. 그죠? Let me find it. For if he knew they were coming, he'd find some excuse to be away that day. Don't tell. 네. 그 뜻일 거예요, 그러면. Did I say it? Or did I read it? 아! No, 죄송해요. I found it. Oh, of course he's good, but he doesn't seem to get any comfort out of it. 네, 그는 선하지만 그거에 대해서 위안을 받지 않는 것 같아요. 선한 거에 자기가 선한데 그거에 그래서 위로를 안 받아요. 그런 뜻이에요. 네. 네 맞아요. 네 그 뜻입니다. 그것에서 뭘 얻지 못한다는 거죠. Okay. "You can make a layer cake," promised Marilla. Monday and Tuesday, great preparations went on at Green Gables. Having the minister and his wife to tea was a serious and important undertaking, and Marilla was determined not to be eclipsed by any of the Avonlea housekeepers. Eclipsed, 누구보다 더 못하기는 싫은 거죠. 자기보다 더 잘했다는 자기가 누구보다 더 못했다는 얘기를 듣기 싫었다는 거예요. eclipse는 우리 sun이랑 moon eclipse라는 뜻이죠. Anne was wild with excitement and delight. She talked it all over with Diana Tuesday night in the twilight as they sat on the big red stones by the Dryad's bubble and made rainbows in the water with little twigs dipped in fir balsam. Everything is ready, Diana, except my cake, which I'm to make in the morning, and the baking powder biscuits which Marilla will make just before tea time. I assure you, Diana, that Marilla and I have had a busy 2 days of it. It's such a responsibility having a minister's family to tea. I never went through such an experience before. You should just see our pantry. It's a sight to behold. We're going to have jelly chicken and cold tongue. We're to have two kinds of jelly, red and yellow, and whipped cream, and lemon pie and cherry pie, and three kinds of cookies and fruit cake, and Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves that she keeps especially for the ministers, and pound cake and layer cake, and biscuits as aforesaid, and new bread and old both, in case the minister is dyspeptic and can't eat new. Mrs. Lynde says ministers are dyspeptic, but I don't think Mr. Allen has been a minister long enough for it to have had a bad effect on him. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Diana, what if it shouldn't be good? I dreamed last night that I was chased all around by a fearful goblin with a big layer cake for a head. 네, 안녕하세요, 이승만님. Let's see what dyspeptic is. I forgot to look this up. 소화불량. 이렇게 부르는군요. 소화불량. 네. old cake는 소화가 더 잘 되나 봐요. new cake보다. new bread보다. 그래서 네, minister들이 주로 소화가 잘 안 되는데 minister 한지 오래 안 돼서 괜찮을 것 같다. It'll be good, all right, assured Diana, who was a very comfortable sort of friend. I'm sure that piece of the one you made that we had for lunch in Idlewood 2 weeks ago was perfectly elegant. Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out bad just when you especially want them to be good, sighed Anne, setting a particularly well balsam twig afloat. However, I suppose I shall just have to trust to Providence and be careful to put in the flour. Oh, look, Diana, what a lovely rainbow! Do you suppose the dryad will come out after we go away and take it for a scarf? 네. 드라이아드는 나무의 요정. 나무의 요정이 나와서 우리가 지금 보는 나뭇가지를 목도리로 할까? 물어봤어요. You know there is no such thing as a dryad, said Diana. 그런 거 나무 요정 같은 거 없잖아. Diana's mother had found out about the haunted wood and had been decidedly angry over it. As a result, Diana had abstained from any further imitative flights of imagination and did not think it prudent to cultivate a spirit of belief, even in harmless dryads. 엄마한테 너무 혼났대요. Haunted wood. 그때 귀신이 나오는 것처럼 상상을 했었잖아요. 어떤 길을. 그래서 그다음부터는 상상력을 발휘를 그렇게 안 한다는 거예요. But it's so easy to imagine there is, said Anne. Every night before I go to bed, I look out of my window and wonder if the dryad is really sitting here, combing her locks with a spring for a mirror. Sometimes I look for her footprints in the dew in the morning. Oh, Diana, don't give up your faith in the dryad. 나무 요정의 믿음을 버리지 마. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She had caught a severe cold in the head by reason of her dabbling in the spring on the preceding evening, but nothing short of absolute pneumonia could have quenched her interest in culinary matters that morning. 네, culinary는 요리와 관련된 이런 뜻이죠. 네. 감기가 심한 감기를 걸렸지만 완전히 폐렴이 아닌 이상 그녀의 요리에 관련된 관심을 없앨 수는 없었다. After breakfast, she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door upon it, she drew a long breath. I'm sure I haven't forgotten anything this time, Marilla, but do you think it will rise? Just suppose perhaps the baking powder isn't good. I used it out of the new can, and Mrs. Lynde says you can never be sure of getting good baking powder nowadays when everything is so adulterated. Mrs. Lynde says the government ought to take the matter up, but she says we'll never see the day when a Tory government will do it. Marilla, what if that cake doesn't rise? 케이크가 이렇게 rise 한다 그러죠? 이렇게 축 주저앉는 게 아니라 rise. 뜬다 그러나요? I don't know. We'll have plenty without it. 그거 없어도 충분히 있어 음식이 먹을 게. Was Marilla's unimpassioned way of looking at the subject. The cake did rise, however, and came out of the oven as light and feathery as golden foam. Anne, flushed with delight, clapped it together with layers of ruby jelly, and in imagination saw Mrs. Allen eating it and possibly asking for another piece. You'll be using the best tea set, of course, Marilla, she said. Can I fix up the table with ferns and wild roses? 제일 좋은 접시 세트 쓰실 거죠? 그런 다음에 이 식탁을 꽃들과 막 장꽃으로 장식해도 될까요? I think that's all nonsense, sniffed Marilla. In my opinion, it's the eatables that matter and not flummery decorations. 먹는 게 중요하지. 장식이 중요한 게 아니야. 그랬더니 애니 뭐라고 했을까요? Mrs. Barry had her table decorated, said Anne, who was not entirely guiltless of the wisdom of the serpent, and the minister paid her an elegant compliment. He said it was a feast for the eye as well as the palate. Mrs. Barry는 Mrs. Barry의 식탁을 장식했는데 목사가 아주 좋은 칭찬을 해줬대요. 미각을 위한 잔치가 아니라 뿐만이 아니라 눈을 위한 잔치기도 하네요. 라고 칭찬을 해 줬대요. 그냥 드라이아드는 나무 요정 맞아요. 요정들이 막 되게 여러 가지가 있는 것 같아요. 페리도 있고 그쵸? 네. 그런 것 같아요. Well, do as you like, said Marilla, who was quite determined not to be surpassed by Mrs. Barry or anybody else. Only mind you leave enough room for the dishes and the food. Mrs. Barry 얘기를 일부러 한 거잖아요. 그 말이 not entirely guiltless of the wisdom of the serpent. 그 뱀의 지혜에 대해서 guiltless? Okay, I'm sorry. Anyway, 그거를 마릴라가 자극을 받을 줄 알고 미세스 베리 얘기를 한 거예요. 왜냐하면 마릴라도 누구보다 더 못했다라는 말을 듣기 싫어하는 걸 알았기 때문에. 하지만 only mind you leave enough room. 신경 써. 그래도 먹을 거를 놓을 자리는 있어야 되니까. Anne laid herself out to decorate in a manner and after a fashion that should leave Mrs. Barry's nowhere. Having abundance of roses and ferns and a very artistic taste of her own, she made that tea table such a thing of beauty that when the minister and his wife sat down to it, they exclaimed in chorus over its loveliness. It's Anne's doing, said Marilla grimly just, and Anne felt that Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness for this world. Matthew was there, having been inveigled into the party, only goodness and Anne knew how. Only goodness knows how, or only God knows how, or only goodness knew how, only goodness and Anne knew how. 네, 아무도 모른다는 거죠. 어떻게 그 자리에 오게 했는지. He had been He had been in such a state of shyness and nervousness that Marilla had given him up in despair, but Anne took him in hand so successfully that he now sat at the table in his best clothes and white collar and talked to the minister not uninterestingly. He never said a word to Mrs. Allen, but that perhaps was not to be expected. All went merry as a marriage bell until Anne's layer cake was passed. Mrs. Allen, having already been helped to a bewildering variety, declined it. But Marilla, seeing the disappointment on Anne's face, said smilingly, "Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen. Anne made it on purpose for you." 너무 배불러서 이제 애한의 케이크 안 먹겠다고 했더니, 아, 애한이 특별히 만든 거예요. 하나 드세요. 그랬더니, in that case, 그렇다면 I must sample it, laughed Mrs. Allen, helping herself to a plump triangle, as did also the minister and Marilla. Mrs. Allen took a mouthful of hers, and a most peculiar expression crossed her face. 아주 이상한 표정이 crossed her face, 지나갔다는 거죠. Not a word did she say, however, but steadily ate away at it. 하지만 아무 말 안 하고 계속 먹었어요. Marilla saw the expression and hastened to taste the cake. "Anne Shirley!" she exclaimed. "What on earth did you put into that cake?" "Nothing but what the recipe said, Marilla," cried Anne with a look of anguish. "Oh, isn't it all right?" "All right? It's simply horrible. Mrs. Allen, don't try to eat it. And taste it yourself. What flavoring did you use?" "무슨 맛을 넣은 거야?" "Vanilla," said Anne, her face scarlet with mortification after tasting the cake. "Only vanilla? Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder. I had my suspicions of that baking powder fiddlesticks. Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used." Anne fled to the pantry and returned with a small bottle partially filled with a brown liquid and labeled yellowly, "Best Vanilla." Marilla took it, uncorked it, smelled it. "Mercy on us, Anne, you flavored that cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week and poured what was left into an old empty vanilla bottle. I suppose it's partly my fault. I should have warned you. But for pity's sake, why couldn't you have smelled it?" 네, anodyne liniment는 요즘에는 없는 거예요. 통증에 바르는 그 당시에 썼던 약입니다. 바르기도 하고 먹기도 했고. 네. 내가 그 에 빈 바닐라 병에다가 내가 그 약이 그 통이 부러져서 그 약을 넣은 건데 왜 냄새를 안 맡았어? Anne dissolved into tears under this double disgrace. "I couldn't. I had such a cold." And with this, she fairly fled to the gable chamber, where she cast herself on the bed and wept as one who refuses to be comforted. Presently, a light step sounded on the stairs, and somebody entered the room. 네, 울고 있는데 누가 들어왔어요? "Oh, Marilla," sobbed Anne without looking up, "I'm disgraced forever. I shall never be able to live this down. It will get out. Things always do get out in Avonlea. Diana will ask me how my cake turned out, and I shall have to tell her the truth. I shall always be pointed at as the girl who flavored a cake with anodyne liniment. The boys in school will never get over laughing at it. Oh, Marilla, if you have a spark of Christian pity, don't tell me that I must go down and wash the dishes after this." 제발 저에게 설거지하라고 하지 마세요. I'll wash them when the minister and his wife are gone, but I cannot ever look Mrs. Allen in the face again. Perhaps she'll think I tried to poison her. 내가 그녀를 도구로 죽이려고 했다고 생각할까 봐. 나는 다시는 못 볼 것 같아요. Mrs. Lynde says she knows an orphan girl who tried to poison her benefactor, but the liniment isn't poisonous. It's meant to be taken internally, although not in cakes. Won't you tell Mrs. Allen so, Marilla? 리너멘트는 먹어도 죽지는 않는다고. 하지만 케이크에 넣는 건 아니지만. 네. "Suppose you jump up and tell her so yourself," said a merry voice. 내가 일부러 죽이려고 한 거 아니라고 얘기해 줄 수 있어요, Marilla? 했더니 일어나서 직접 얘기하지 그래." 그랬어요. 그랬더니 Anne flew up to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed, surveying her with laughing eyes. "My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this," she said, genuinely disturbed by Anne's tragic face. "Why, it's all just a funny mistake that anybody might make." "Oh, no, it takes me to make such a mistake," said Anne forlornly. "아무나 할 수 있는 실수지." 그랬더니 "아니에요. 저만 할 수 있는 실수예요." "And I wanted to have that cake so nice for you, Mrs. Allen." "Yes, I know, dear, and I assure you I appreciate your kindness and thoughtfulness just as much as if it had turned out all right. Now you mustn't cry any more, but come down with me and show me your flower garden. Miss Cuthbert tells me you have a little plot all your own. I want to see it, for I'm very much interested in flowers." Anne permitted herself to be led down and comforted, reflecting that it was really providential that Mrs. Allen was a kindred spirit. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake, and when the guests went away, Anne found that she had enjoyed the evening more than could have been expected, considering that terrible incident. Nevertheless, she sighed deeply. "Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet?" Marilla, 내일은 새로운 날이고 아직 실수가 없는 날이라는 거 생각하니까 너무 좋지 않나요? "I'll warrant you'll make plenty in it," said Marilla. "I never saw you beat for making mistakes, Anne." 하지만 내일 되면 또 실수를 하겠지. "Yes, and well I know it," admitted Anne mournfully. "But have you ever noticed one encouraging thing about me, Marilla? 하지만 저에게 아주 좋은 점 한 가지는 가 뭔지 아세요? I never make the same mistake twice. 똑같은 실수는 두 번은 안 해요." "I don't know as that's much benefit when you're always making new ones." 그게 무슨 유익인지 모르겠어. 맨날 새로운 실수를 하는데. "Oh, don't you see, Marilla? There must be a limit to the mistakes one person can make, and when I get to the end of them, then I'll be through with them. That's a very comforting thought." Marilla. 하지만 한 사람이 만들 수 있는 실수는 할 수 있는 실수는 분명히 한계가 있을 거예요. 그리고 내가 거의 끝을 보면 그다음에는 실수 안 할 거예요. 되게 위안이 되는 생각입니다. "Well, you'd better go and give that cake to the pigs," said Marilla. "It isn't fit for any human to eat, not even Jerry Buote." 가서 케이크 마저 남은 거 돼지들에게 주라고. 사람은 먹을 수 없다고. 아! 레이첼님 감사합니다. 재미있다고 해 주셔서 저만 재미있는 게 아니군요. 네. 설명이 도움이 되시나요? 아니면 그냥 쭉 읽는 게 도움이 되시나요? 댓글에 알려주시면 준비하는 데 도움이 되겠습니다. 앤이 되게 웃기죠. 네. This was the end of chapter 21. 다음 주는 it's a shorter chapter. 다음 주는 쪼끔 짧으니 준비해 오실 수 있는 분들은 준비하시면 더 도움이 되실 것 같아요. 설명 좋아요. 오케이 good. 감사합니다. 네. 제가 이거 하면서 쪼끔 한국말이 느는 것 같아서 네 저에게도 도움이 됩니다. 제리 뷰어트는 우리 처음에 나왔었죠. 도와주는 남자아이. 프랑스에서 온 되게 그 집안이 어려우니깐 일을 하는 거예요. 학교를 안 다니고. 그 당시에는 애들이 다 학교를 안 갔었나 봐요. 그래서 매튜를 도와주는 남자아이예요. 우리 그 넷플릭스에 나오는 앤에도 제리 나오죠. 근데 이 책에서는 제리가 거의 안 나오는데 우리 그 넷플릭스에서는 아주 많이 나오는 캐릭터더라고요. 그래서 저는 제리가 그걸 보면서 '제리가 누구지?' 전혀 몰라요. '이 뭐야 이거 책에선 안 나왔던 었는데 그랬는데 다시 읽어 보니 있긴 있더라고요. 그래서 어쩌다 한 번씩 출연을 합니다. 맞아요. 네. alright. 네. 되게 현찮은 부족한 한국말이지만 네. 네 맞아요. 제가 I will do my best to try to explain. Alright. Good night everybody. I will see you next week.